Hello, my name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our webinar on temporary unions in the early modern world, part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us today and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I would like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the association, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat at the end of the conversation today. A few logistical things to cover before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Once the discussion is, or the roundtable introductions are concluded, you'll have a chance to, please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but also want to be mindful of the time. So we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording on YouTube in about a week. I'll now turn things over to the chair of our session today, Mary Wiesner-Hanks from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and greetings and welcome to the virtual AHA. We were just thinking, I was thinking today about how strange it is that here's the AHA in April as opposed to in January, and we're not trying to fight off thinking about various climate battles that we fought over the years. Denver, if any of you happened to be at that one, wading through the slush and the snow. Not having to do this here and others. So we just all hope that by next year we can see each other again really in New Orleans, where the AHA should be and where there probably won't be slush or snow. Before I turn things over to our roundtable panelists, I'd like to thank Karina Johnson, who organized this panel, who got us together and suggested the whole topic in the first place. Karina is a person who often thinks very much in global and comparative terms, and this is we're really grateful to her for having given us this opportunity to think about these issues in a kind of comparative way. Each of our panelists has dealt with them in their own particular part of the world and sometimes comparatively, but Karina is really allowing us to think about this in a more comparative way. So what we mean by temporary unions, just for kind of a quick overview, is that marriages and other kinds of unions, sexual and otherwise, other kinds of intimate unions. These are unions that created economic links and intimate bonds in many locations around the early modern world. They often occurred in transregional trading contexts between long distance traveling men and women who remained in place. But in contrast to later kinds of colonial sexual relationships, the women participating in these unions exercised significant agency in pursuit of their own and their families' social and economic interests. So what this roundtable does is it brings together people who look at these in 4 different parts of the world to look at commonalities and differences in these kinds of temporary unions, as well as the forms, the significance of such unions for early modern history of gender and sexuality and the economy, and I would say actually everything else as well. Intimacy, religion, and what's not affected by them. We'll see. So I've asked each of because it seemed to me kind of odd for me to introduce people. So I've asked each of the panelists to introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentation. And then we'll have, this is a roundtable, so relatively short presentations rather than formal papers. And there'll be plenty of time then for Q&A afterwards. And we'll take the panelists in the order in which they appear in the program, such as beginning with Barbara Andaya, then to Allyson Poska, then to Eric Schluessel, and then to Marcia Yonemoto. So in that order, and we'll hear from all of the panelists, and then we'll have a little bit of time for the panelists to talk with each other, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. Again, as you heard at the beginning, if you could submit your questions through the Q&A, we'll try it that way first, and then we'll maybe go to the chat forum as we run out of questions, or if we run out of questions in the Q&A. And I'll moderate the questions through the Q&A and try to see if there's some that are similar or to combine them. But otherwise, we'll try to have as normal a conversation as we can in these particular kind of circumstances. Okay, so take it away, Barbara.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this webinar. I'll just very quickly introduce myself. As you can see, I'm associated or I'm employed by the University of Hawaii. I wasn't born in Hawaii, quite obviously. I grew up in Australia, and for me in Australia, Asia was not China or Japan or India or Korea, but Southeast Asia. And that's the area that I've devoted my career to studying, and my mission in life is to insert more Southeast Asia into global conversations. So I have been working at the University of Hawaii since 1994. I did my PhD at Cornell, and I am currently general editor of the new Cambridge History of Southeast Asia 3-volume work, but also for my sins I'm contracted to work on a new book on gender and sexuality in Southeast Asia from the beginnings, from slime to modernity. So that's me. I'm going to, so I should share my screen now, Mary. So I'm going to start now and share my screen. And as you can see, I'm going to be talking about temporary marriage in Southeast Asia. So there are a couple of things that I want to make, the point that I want to make, first of all, that the temporary marriage concept in Southeast Asia was fundamentally linked to economics, as Mary pointed out, to trade. And it was a feature of the early modern period because at that time, global trade was expanding and Southeast Asia was caught up at in unprecedented ways. And the picture that I've shown on the right-hand side shows a woman selling fruit in the market, sitting underneath an umbrella, but it's just a symbol of the fact that women dominated local markets, and still to this very day. And so when foreign traders came in, they encountered an economy where women played a very prominent part in making and selling their own products in their domestic economy. And for any trader, they needed help with language and access to kinship-based networks. We have to remember that for most of Southeast Asia, for ordinary people, this was a semi-literate or even illiterate society. So all trade really depended on trust. Who do you trust? You trust your kinfolk. So it was very important to get into that network. And temporary marriage served those purposes. And so the picture that I've shown here is from Malacca in present-day Malaysia. It's from the mid-17th century, and it's called the way of trafficking by exchange. And you can see here on the right-hand side, there are a group of traders, probably from India. They seem to have bought some fruits, they're holding some fruit in baskets, and they're paying the group of women on the left-hand side for that. But to reinforce that contemporary picture of women in trade, I've also included some others here from the Philippines, a woman selling a rattan mat that she would have made herself, but along with that, she probably would have taken textiles that she'd woven herself. And on the right-hand side, you can see an Indonesian woman selling toys. She has some little flags. She has some spinning tops. She has some little model animals at the side. She probably made most of those herself as well. They're produced in the domestic economy. So it was low scale in some ways, but still extremely important. So coming to temporary marriage then, how did it work? So a foreign trader would take a local woman, sometimes the family would, or the woman would approach him for a period that could be a short, it could be a three weeks, it could be years and years and years. He could, every season he would come back. And so by doing that, he became a son or a brother in his wife's family. But there were real obligations that made this custom work. First of all, husband and wife should be faithful while they were married. It didn't matter how long the marriage lasted, but that was a true marriage. The trader had to deal with the woman's family as if they were his own. So there were lots of obligations, going to ceremonies, giving presents, da-da-da-dum. And if he left, if he should give the wife some sort of compensation, some sort of money to maintain any children. If he didn't return after 3 years, she was free to remarry. So who benefited? So first of all, the traders obviously benefited because of women's deep knowledge of the local economy and of also their understanding of currency. There was a time when all kinds of currencies were circulating and women knew equivalences very, very well. So they were, you can see here a local woman with Chinese traders. So she can manage their store for them. She can work out business arrangements with locals. She can bring her family in to develop networks. She also maintains the trader's household. She cares for any children resulting from the union. And you can see in the two pictures, a woman with Chinese traders, but also particularly a group of Chinese children. This is from the 1830s, this picture, but you can see this boy sitting here with a shaved head at the side. That is not a normal Javanese hairstyle. So I think he's the son of a Chinese trader, son of a Chinese. But they would stay at home, they would stay with the mother, and she would care for them. But women benefited too, because foreign men gave gifts, they gave money, they gave goods to both her and her family. And particularly they acquired new languages and trade-related skills. So, and should their husband leave, remarriage was very easy. Southeast Asians on the whole didn't worry too much about having sequential marriages. So because they had experience and they'd gained status because of that, they could remarry very easily. Their children could often gain important positions because they had a foot in two cultures. And the illustration that on the right-hand side from the 17th century shows a European man with his local wife, and you can see that they have a servant. The parasol is actually, they were carrying this parasol illegally. You're not supposed to do that, but it was a status sign. But they're carrying a parasol, which is a sign of status, and they have a servant. So she gains in status. But over time, the attitudes of foreign men began to change. There was a foreign tendency to see temporary marriages as simply a commercial transaction because they were giving money and gifts. And because sexual intercourse that was bought through exchanges of gifts or money didn't really involve affection or commitment. And these attitudes were exacerbated by the growing number of single male Chinese, which contributed to an already marked gender imbalance in many port cities. So it was actually a lot less trouble to buy a couple of female slaves who could provide sexual services and help with trade, rather than enter into all the complicated arrangements and family obligations that a temporary marriage entailed. And coupled with that were the attitudes to Southeast Asian women, particularly among Europeans, who saw them, because of the way they dressed, public bathing and so forth, as ultimately essentially immoral, that they were no better than a sex worker. So temporary marriages intensified that kind of attitude. They were seen over time, not initially, but over time, they were just seen, oh, these women are just willing to exchange money and gifts for sex. And so we find by the 18th century, Europeans and Chinese foreign traders are tending to treat their women, who are often slaves or minority groups, not as real wives, but as prostitutes. And so there was no obligation to be faithful. And that was a cornerstone of the temporary marriage. So increasingly, marriages were primarily for convenience. And increasingly, women living with Europeans and Chinese were slaves, lower class women, or marginalized minorities. And this was a reminder of the fact that marriage involved recurring obligations that couldn't be ignored. And many men just didn't want to take on those obligations. Slaves could equally be housekeepers, cooks, bed partners. They didn't always have access to the networks, but they could serve a number of other functions. And more particularly, they could be easily sold if money was needed. The English traders in Eastern Indonesia sold their housekeepers when they needed money. And in Batavia, in Dutch Batavia, Dutch authorities would punish a European living with a man who was not married. But if she was a slave, it was okay because she was just property. So at the end of the 18th century, the temporary wife, which had previously, 200 years earlier, had been quite a high status position, this was no longer the case. And the temporary wife, a woman who had assumed some high status in her community, was now in most places replaced by slaves and concubines who were regarded as disposable prostitutes. There was also a growing European suspicion of half-castes, as I'm using that term in their terminology, people of mixed descent, and their children did not enjoy the previous privileged position that they'd once had. And yet it's interesting, I've put this new web novel, History Contract, as an illustration, because still today, sex workers in Southeast Asia often hope that they can be a wife to a foreigner during the term of his employment, what the Indonesians called an istri contract, a contract wife. And this novel has been serialized in just recently, in 8 editions. So it's still a matter for comment. So I'll end there and stop my share and leave it to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's just out of curiosity, is that novel in English or is it in
It's in Indonesian, unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Interesting. All right, and we move then from Southeast Asia to the Atlantic and from Barbara to Allyson.
Hi, I'm Allyson Poska. I'm a professor of history at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and I'm a scholar of the Spanish Empire, both Spain and the Americas. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today is this world of temporary reunions on both the peninsula and a little bit about the Americas. So there's this saying in the Spanish-speaking world, mejor amancebada que mal casada. Better to be happily cohabiting than badly married. And this is actually during the early modern period, this is a commonplace that shows up in a number of different conversations, whether the people are talking to the Inquisition or talking to, their friends. And we can see that people actually acted on this notion, as in some parts of Spain and in large parts of the Americas, large numbers, sometimes upwards of 30% of children were born out of wedlock. And many, if not most of these children were the product of relationships, temporary in some ways, not necessarily one-night stands. Now, for me, this roundtable raises the issue of the degree to which these non-marital relationships were intentional, or were they in some way the unintended consequence of relationships that just didn't work out? And what I want to talk about today is that for many of the women that I study, informal unions, and I'm going to talk about that here in a minute, were viewed as viable alternatives to marriage for an array of important reasons, not as failures of traditional marriage. So first of all, I want to address this issue of temporary unions, because I don't think that in my case, this accurately describes the relationships that I've studied in the Spanish Empire, or that temporary unions had anything to do with the way that people in the early modern Spanish world understood the relationships that either at the beginning or at the end. We know that even though people entered into a variety of relationships with an array of expectations, for reasons that are not clear to me, historians often assume that people in the past wanted to or expected to get into a marriage, this kind of predefined process of marriage post-Tridentine church way, which would be engagement, the promise of marriage in the future, followed by at some point a promise of marriage in the present, the actual administration of the sacrament. And that marriage would last until the death of one of the spouses. In the modern historians tend to think that that was a great idea. I'm not clear that people thought about that much at all in the early modern period. My work and the work of others indicates that many, if not most, men and women in the Spanish Empire may have believed at some point they were entering into long-term monogamous relationships, but they may or may not have intended for those relationships to be formalized by Catholic marriage. And I do want to say that this is unlike early modern one-night stands or flings. I mean, this is nothing to do with prostitution, right? I think that people thought that maybe these might turn out in the same way that we often enter into relationships that might or might not work out. And sometimes they do lead to marriage and sometimes they don't. I don't think that generally people believe that these were temporary. And that's why I'm going to use the term informal unions as opposed to temporary unions, because I think that that's more reflective of what I have studied. So for me, a strong indicator that informal unions were acknowledged alternatives to marriage is that both canon law and Castilian legal norms actually facilitate them. So officially, there's intense Catholic opposition to these unions, and there's increasing pressure to marriage in the post-Tridentine period. But canon law created a scenario that actually allowed for the easy transition of partners who'd been involved in these informal unions to marriage. Without penalty, a partner could either marry the person with whom he or she had been in an informal relationship or marry somebody else altogether, unless a promise of marriage had been made to the first partner. An informal union was no hindrance to the reception of the sacrament of marriage. Moreover, exactly like their legitimate siblings, illegitimate children produced from these informal unions received the sacrament of baptism, so that from a spiritual perspective, the offspring produced by these informal relationships suffered no stigma. Now, Castilian legal norms also acknowledged the status of informal unions, whether or not they ended in marriage. Most importantly, when those relationships ended, women could sue for the loss of their virginity if a promise of marriage had been abrogated, and for child support if a child had been produced. And this is how I got into studying these relationships, is through these broken marriage contracts. If the child was illegitimate and the parents eventually married, the child was then legitimized. So from a Castilian legal standpoint too, no harm, no foul from these informal unions. Now, just as importantly, there seems to have been little or no social stigma to engaging in these informal unions, as partners easily seem to move on to new relationships. I never found any evidence that somebody couldn't get married eventually to somebody else because they had been involved in an informal union previously. And illegitimacy does not, for the most part, seem to have hindered most people's marriage prospects, although it might impact their inheritance in the long run if there were legitimate siblings. And in fact, the conquest of the Americas and the extension of Spanish civil and religious institutions across the Atlantic actually, in my mind, created a context in which women of all races and classes on both sides of the ocean often preferred informal unions to Catholic marriage. As these relationships, and these are actually, Mary kind of used my words, allowed them to exercise considerable agency when faced with any of a number of situations, including neglect, violence, abandonment, the desire for some autonomy, and in order to ensure the social and economic stability of themselves and of their children. In Spain, informal unions are surprisingly common during the early modern period at both the top and the bottom of society. During the 15th and 16th centuries, informal unions were used as a family strategy by the Spanish nobility. Now, Grace Coolidge is finishing what I think is going to be a really important book on this issue that looks at the remarkable frequency of long-term informal unions among the richest and most powerful men and women in Spain, including the high clergy. These women, who are often high-ranking themselves, opted into these relationships for a variety of effective and financial and political reasons. They bore these noblemen children. The noblemen then cared for these children born of these relationships, despite their illegitimacy, sometimes worked to have them legitimized, and then used them as a mechanism to perpetuate their lineage, particularly in the world of high infant mortality. On the other end of the social spectrum, my own work has showed that peasant women, in my case in northwestern Spain, where large numbers of men migrated, also preferred these unions. When men migrated, marriage left women unable to engage in new relationships. They left their children financially vulnerable, lonely, and potentially isolated. To give you just one example, in 1593, Maria de Fiscal was denounced to the Spanish Inquisition for saying that as her husband had left her for another woman, she would rather be emancibada, cohabiting, than unhappily married, because as it was, her life with her husband was, and these are her words, doing no service to the Lord. Women like Maria knew that both their presence and their futures would be more stable if they were not married than if they were. In the Americas, scholars have generally attributed really high rates of informal unions to some combination of Spanish men not wanting to take permanent responsibility for their relationships with indigenous, mestiza, and African descended women. And the other thing they often say is attributed to is the ostensibly high cost of getting clergy to administer the sacrament. However, there too, even women who could have married did not always do so. While upper class white women in the Americas did not publicly engage in informal relationships like their peninsular counterparts, and Twynham has demonstrated that many did so in secret, drawn into those clandestine relationships by some combination of deception and love and/or lust, which I cannot emphasize how important love and lust are in this circumstance. Free women of color and poor white women opted for informal unions for many of the same reasons that I just discussed about women in Spain. They could more easily leave problematic relationships. They could pursue new relationships when they fell in love or lust with somebody else. And they could maintain some economic independence if they so desired. And they could do so with little or no social stigma and few legal implications. So despite the admonishments from both ecclesiastical and civil authorities, men, and my timer keeps going off, women and men in the Spanish Empire understood the social and emotional and economic value of informal relationships, even if they look marriage-like. It's important that we remember that many people, but especially women, saw informal unions as useful alternatives to deal with a wide range of emotional, financial, and living circumstances that the constraints and permanence of Catholic marriage would have made much more difficult. Thanks.
Clicking on the wrong mute button, unmute button. So thanks, Allyson. And now we'll keep going westward, excuse me, across the Pacific again. And we seem to be really going on a generally westerly direction, and then go to Eric, right?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'll share a screen if that's all right. And yeah, I'm Eric Schluessel, Assistant Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. I'm a social historian of China and Central Asia from the, say, mid-18th to the early 20th centuries. And that's kind of the framing I'm going to be using for the talk today. We might not necessarily think, well, By the way, here's your orientation in case you're not familiar with the Qing Empire, this geographical framing. This is a map indicating Xinjiang in the west, where we're spending our time. Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, is now known, as often in the news, as the Uyghur homeland. But we're going to go back to the mid-18th century and see how sort of new vast changes in the Eurasian economy and geopolitics intersected with local kinship practices. I'm trying to change my slide. There we go. So the temporal framing from the mid 18th to the late 19th century might not seem very early modern, but one point I want to make today is that we have a tendency when looking at Xinjiang to focus on ethnicity and then ultimately assume that we must study that through the practices, the documents that we associate with, say, modern history. People often look for the roots of modern ethnicity and ethnic difference in this borderland area. And search for documents that aren't necessarily there because there isn't really the kind of systematic archive we would hope for. Instead, in my investigations into temporary unions in this region over the past decade, I find that it is in the silences in the manuscript archive that we find most of the most interesting phenomena and the most demonstrative phenomena. And in fact, so you see here a list of the various groups of people who lived in this region during this century. Turkic-speaking Muslims who referred themselves mainly as Musulman or Muslim, who we now think of as Uyghur, Manchus, Mongols, garrison soldiers, settlers and traders, Chinese-speaking Muslims who are kind of liminal between local Muslims and Chinese, Hindustani merchants. And every time I look into relations between these communities, the issue of temporary unions comes up. So it actually seems like this is very close to the heart of the negotiation of those boundaries around community, groupness, ethnicity, and belonging, and yet they haven't been attended to in the scholarship before. So I think it's important to take, take a view of very intimate relationships in order to understand this bigger picture that we're also focused on. It doesn't seem very early modern, perhaps, but this is actually the period in which we see trans-imperial merchant networks making inroads and the initial stages of the commercialization of the economy. And indeed, the issue of temporary unions is evident even from the late 1700s when it comes up in treaty negotiations between the Qing and the neighboring Khanate of Hokkien to the west, because it was evidently already very common for local Turkic-speaking Muslims, especially parents, to sign a fixed-term contract with a sojourner from a wealthier part of Central Asia to provide him with domestic, sexual, and sometimes reproductive labor on a temporary basis. This was not considered a problem locally because it was union between Muslims, and yet it already posed sort of diplomatic issues, problems of who was whose subject and who was subject to which taxes. Now, I said that it's broadly accepted, locally speaking. Not always. This is a society in which serial marriage was frequent, but polygamy was very rare. And so although Muslim sojourners frequently contracted these temporary unions when they were far from home, actually, as I dig through the archive, I find that wives who had heard about their husbands taking wives elsewhere often shut the doors on their husbands when they came home and demanded apologies or restitution, and would even go to the Chinese authorities demanding these things, arguing on the basis of good Confucian values, although they were themselves Muslims, that a man was not supposed to take a second wife. Well, then of course you have the problem of the archive. What do we call these relationships? If you go into the Chinese archive, there's a problem of labels. The Chinese authorities didn't know what to make of these unions. There was no word for them. Was this woman a concubine? Was she a prostitute? Was she a wife? And people who approached Chinese power learned how to manipulate these terms that the administration used to characterize their relationships in different ways in order to achieve certain outcomes around various disputes. So again, that wife who shut the door on her husband might say, well, he's gone off and claimed that he is a second primary wife. That's inappropriate. And he would counter, well, I'm a man, I'm allowed to take a concubine. Neither category was active in the local discourse. But I suppose part of the issue is that there was no term for temporary marriage locally speaking. In modern Uyghur, we call it vakapatoy, but this is an ethnographic category imposed in the 1950s, referring to a much older practice. So what we have is a language game where people are constantly talking around temporary unions, censoring them, praising them, having disputes about them, without having a clear label for them. As you can see on the screen, this confused the Chinese authorities, who eventually decided that Muslim women were simply sexually wanton, and were all, as one of them put it, half prostitutes anyway. And others decided that, well, Muslim men clearly have no sense of their lineage because they don't know who their parents are. This became a point of moral censure on the part of the Chinese authorities. Meanwhile, Chinese settlers and sojourners who came from outside of the Muslim community began to take advantage of this system as well. But and this is a lot like the Southeast Asian case, they didn't necessarily know what they were getting into. I've seen disputes where a man took a local wife, and then when he prepared to leave, he was going to take her with him. And her parents went to the magistrate and said, wait a second, we signed a contract for a temporary union. And in the Chinese document, it just says marriage. But in the Chagatai document, which is the literary language used at this time in Arabic script, it does not say that. It doesn't actually say temporary union. It just says nikah, or marriage, which is another problem. Because if you go to the legal sources, there's no distinction. The same ritual was used for a temporary marriage on a contractual basis as for a normative marriage. This even came up in those treaty negotiations between the Qing and Hokkien. They said, we looked at the Islamic law books, we can't find a precedent for this either way, so what do we do? Well, it's a problem for us too, because it comes up in the archives, it leads to suspicion over people of mixed heritage. It's something everyone's concerned about, but no one will put a label on. Well, let's see. What I've found in the archive is that there's a practical difference that emerges. You can see it in the formation of temporary marriages. When the sojourner man entering the contract is a Turkic-speaking Muslim and therefore a member of the in-group, we see an exchange of goods, which is meant to symbolically integrate, again, thinking of the Southeast Asia case, symbolically integrate the sojourner into the host community on a seasonal basis, because usually you would sojourn into a place for a season and wait for the passes to clear before you could go over the mountains again the next year. For the out group, in this case, a Chinese-speaking Muslim, a Hawai'i person, we see exchanges of silver, which, following the broader symbolic logic that we can see active in the textual record at this time and then later on from anthropological studies, marks this child as someone who's being sold to an out group. It's the same kind of ritual you'd perform in order to symbolically protect the child from the evil eye by symbolically selling them out of the household to another family, making them a symbolic adoptee. This seems to be the best clue that we have. It does trace the emergence of temporary marriage right back to sort of the commercialization of the economy and the increasing involvement of these local communities in trans-regional trade based on the movement of silver. And this kind of serves as a diagnostic when we're looking at records of, okay, do we see a clear patterning where out-group temporary unions are based on money and in-group temporary unions are based on goods? Yes. Here is a Manchu ballad, the Song of Lashihiantu, which today is upheld as a symbol of ethnic unity in Xinjiang and in modern China, because the story of love between a Manchu garrison soldier and a Turkic Muslim, a Uyghur woman named Gulbahar, Lashihiantu and Gulbahar. If you look at the text itself, however, we actually see two marriage ceremonies take place within it. They fall in love, sure, and then they go to her parents' house, and all of a sudden there's a lot of Turkic vocabulary used in this Manchu ballad, and he provides some silver. They say the prayers, they go through the ceremony, and he and Gulbahar finally have their magical night together. But then the ballad turns and says, well, we're not actually married. We're not allowed to be married according to Muslim law, so we'll have to find someone else to marry us properly so that they can actually be happily ever after. And so we seem to see the temporary marriage and then the more formal or normative marriage, which is only able to be performed in secret in order to cross a boundary between these two different groups. Now, we are feeling in the dark when we look for temporary unions in 18th and 19th century China in many ways because of the state of the archive. But through ethnographic methods like these, through historical anthropology, I think it's been increasingly possible to get a sense of how boundaries were formed between people, which unions were considered temporary and which were long-term, and thus to read the archives and sources like these against the grain. In the longer term, however, I think we are missing one critical piece of understanding this, and that is that we don't have a finely grained economic history of Xinjiang itself that would help us understand how merchants operate in society, and thus how sojourners engaged in these temporary unions. And so I think long story short, it opens up a lot of methodological questions and difficulties, but I think leads us to attend to things that we ought to have been attending to for a long time. Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. And now we'll go to Marcia.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to Karina, if she's out there somewhere, for organizing this panel. I've learned a lot already. I am a professor of history at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm a specialist in early modern Japanese cultural history. My previous work is focused on, most recently, on women, gender, and family. And I'm working presently on a book on the history of adoption in Japan from roughly 1700 to 1925-ish. And that book focuses a great deal on one of the most prevalent forms of adoption in Japan, which is adult adoption. So I'm going to talk today about temporary unions in the context of the Japanese family. And what I'm interested in is in this sort of seeming conundrum between short-term family alliances, both marriages and adoptions. And I'll talk about the ways in which those two institutions are linked in early modern Japan. So the link between short-term family alliances and long-term familial stability. And I'm interested in how the former enable the latter. So the context for this discussion is the STEM family system. And you all, I'm sure the panelists are all familiar with the STEM family system, but just to give a brief description, the STEM family was the dominant form of family formation in Japan by about the 18th century. And Fabian Drixler's research has shown this more or less. And in the STEM family, 3 generations at most lived together. The overall size of the co-resident group was small, and generally only one offspring, the male heir, and eventually his spouse, remained in the home. All the other siblings were expected to leave the home upon marriage or adoption for work, although there were some exceptions. And depending on family resources, some unmarried children might remain at home, although their fate was kind of unenviable, as reflected in the term for an unmarried dependent son, which was heazumi, literally stuck in his room, though perhaps housebound is a nicer translation. So the STEM family had great survivability over time, and yet precisely because of its streamlined and efficient nature, the margin for error could be very narrow. If you had no heir, that meant extinguishing the family line, which of course was to be avoided at all costs. So somewhat paradoxically, the many constraints of the STEM family led to the growth of increasingly flexible boundaries governing its membership. In order to secure heirs and thus to survive, families had to be flexible about what kinds of individuals would be absorbed into the family, primarily through marriage, but also through adoption. STEM families also had to be flexible, perhaps even ruthless, about severing those family ties if the union was not working for the family. That is, if it was not contributing to its long-term survivability and prosperity. With regard to marriage, rules regarding practically everything, status, commensurability, dowry, and so forth, could be stretched or finagled to make a match suitable, even if by most standards it was not, and divorce was an easy solution if the marriage proved unsuitable or unproductive for the family. Likewise, the purview of acceptable adoptees extended to include types of individuals who in other contexts, that is in other places and other cultures, typically have been excluded, namely adults, women and girls, kin, or non-kin, as the case may be. Adopters, for their part, had to be older than adoptees, except in cases when they were actually younger, and they had to be alive, except when they were in fact dead. Lots of cases of dead samurai adopting heirs. Luke Roberts's work gives new definition to the term deathbed adoption. And like an unsuitable spouse, the ties to an unsuitable adoptee could also be terminated by the adopter. In fact, the term for ending an adoptive relationship was the same as that for divorce in the early modern period, dien, literally severing the union or severing the tie. To make matters somewhat more complicated, marriage and adoption were woven together in the frequent practice of adopting a daughter's husband in order to make him the family heir. The adoption and the marriage happened simultaneously, and the term for this type of adoptee is mukoyoshi, or literally husband adoptee. And this was widely practiced by all classes in early modern Japan. In contrast to late imperial China, where it was strictly limited, and Choson Korea, where it was not allowed at all. And it's still practiced in Japan today. Like an unmarried bride, adopted sons-in-law could also be summarily dismissed, simultaneously divorced and disinherited if things didn't work out. So in other words, when it came to heir acquisition, family and lineage continuity trumped practically everything else. Adoption and marriage or adoptee marriage were the primary avenues through which outsiders became insiders, and rien, the severing of family ties, was the primary avenue through which those family members became outsiders once again. Now, when speaking of the temporary nature of marriage and the frequency of divorce, we kind of yearn for statistics, but early modern statistics aren't terribly representative. Nevertheless, I'll give them to you anyway. Divorce rates varied widely by status and region, but across all status groups, historical demographers tend to characterize early modern Japan as a high divorce society. Satomi Kurosu, who's extensively studied population registers in northeastern Japan, found that in two villages, Shimomoriya and Nitta, for whom extraordinarily complete population registers exist, between 1760 and 1870, quote, divorce was the most common reason for marital dissolution. In all, 43% of first marriages among peasants dissolved in divorce before the individuals reached age 50, surpassing the proportion becoming widows and widowers. So divorce was a more frequent reason for ending a marriage than than the death of the spouse. She continues, it is striking that more than half, 55%, of exor local marriages, so that would be adopted sons-in-law, ended in divorce. Contrary to a common belief that divorce tended to be advantageous for men and husbands, more men in exor local marriages than women in vira local marriage experienced departure from the household of marriage, end quote. This is from a 2011 study. Other studies of rural communities elsewhere in Japan estimate that between 11 and 40% of marriages ended in divorce. In the samurai class, and again with the requisite disclaimer for regional and status discrepancies or rank discrepancies within the class, samurai class, divorce rates for the entire early modern period seem to have hovered around 10 to 11% for all ranks within the samurai class. And among daimyo, the local lords, divorce increased over time, with roughly 15% of daimyo marriages ending in dissolution in the 18th century. So, like divorce, remarriage was frequent and unproblematic for both men and women, as we've been hearing in many different contexts. And often in early modern Japan, it was very quick to be arranged after divorce or death of a spouse. Also, serial adoption was not uncommon. Men and women who were adopted into one house might leave it through dissolution of the adoption, but still be adopted by another family. Or one also sees examples of families taking in several adopted sons-in-law, one after another for their daughters, divorcing and disinheriting them only to take in a replacement soon thereafter. Or one also sees cases in which women were serially adopted, usually to raise their status before marriage. Here, some case studies work best to illustrate what statistics really can't reveal. One example is of Kobayashi Maki, daughter of a domainal physician in Okayama in the early 19th century, which in Japan counts as early modern, just as it does in other parts of Asia. So Kobayashi Maki's case illustrates a number of these types of temporary union. Maki had only one sister, so there's no male heirs. So her family adopted the sister's husband as their heir, and that couple subsequently had children, including a son to carry on the family line, which kind of frees up Maki as a freer agent. So at the age of 16, her family sends her out for adoption by her childless paternal uncle, a guy named Kobayashi Kozaemon. And Kozaemon was born a commoner, but he had, by dint of connections and hard work, managed to attain samurai status as a hatamoto, a bannerman directly in service to the shogun. and he was living in Edo earning a modest stipend. So by virtue of her adoption, Maki rises definitively into the samurai class. By birth, her father's a physician. He's kind of is a liminal class. He's in service to a daimyo, but he himself is not a samurai. So by being adopted by her samurai uncle, Maki becomes of the samurai class. And Kozaemon, the uncle slash father, adopted father, plans to arrange a marriage for her, which he did, and to adopt her husband as his heir, which he also did. But the husband died after a short period of marriage, during which Maki bore a daughter and a son. So a few years after the death of her first husband, Kozaemon arranges a second marriage for Maki with another man of bannerman status named Ito Kaname. But because Ito's family was of higher status than her adoptive father Kozaemon, before Maki could marry Ito Kaname, she had to be adopted by a family of status equivalent to that of the Ito. So Maki is adopted by Nakamura Sohei and then married to Ito. And with Ito Kaname, Maki has another son and another daughter. When they came of age, Maki helped arrange one marriage for her older daughter Nao, which ended in divorce, no children, two marriages for her daughter Tama. The first was an adopted son-in-law whom they seem to have taken into the family solely for his dowry money, and then who conveniently died to make way for a son that was born to Maki and Ito Kaname late in life, who then assumed the family heirship. She arranged two adoptions and one marriage for her older son, Segoro, from her first marriage, who was adopted into a house called the Yamamuro. He had 4 sons and 1 daughter. And Maki was assessing possible spouses for her younger son, Kinnojo, and he was at the time around early adolescent, at the time that her correspondence with her parents, which is the main record for her activities, ceases. So I could give other examples, and I have some very complicated genealogical charts that I could show you that chart transitions in marriages, in adoptions, in adopted husbands, and so on and so forth. But I think I'll just leave it there and say that these transitory phases, adoptions, some of them fleetingly brief to facilitate status appropriate marriages, which themselves were sometimes fleeting in duration due to divorce or death, these were common in the lives of many, many people in early modern Japan. Again, I could give many different examples, but the point is, I think that all these temporary unions enabled the stability and the perpetuity of the family over time. And it's remarkable how that institution of the family could be so fluid and porous and yet so much more permanent than any of its constituent parts. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcia. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I think there isn't a giant queue. I mean queue in both ways. And if you could put your question in the Q&A, but I think I'd like to have a little chance to see if the panelists, if you want to unmute and have questions for each other. And I'll take my position as the chair to really ask a question of Marcia, and this is getting back to Allyson's point about women's agency, in that I think that we started off looking at where we can see it, certainly in both what Barbara and Allyson were talking about, women's agency in arranging their own union with somebody. But what we're seeing with Marcia is women's agency in arranging unions involving other family members, daughters, and and sort of the kind of thing that I know that Grace Coolidge actually also sees in noble, and other people do, of noble women and upper class women in Spain arranging unions, including marriage, but other stuff for other family members, and sort of women's role in this playing a kind of family power broker that extends, I mean, we often sort of dismiss this, oh yeah, women arranged marriages, but to really see what's going on here, I think means that we shouldn't just dismiss it as, oh yeah, women arranged marriages.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that question. So yeah, I've, in my previous work, and this is something that's always interested me, is the role of women as as the people who do kin work, right? Who construct, carefully construct these families. At the same time, so someone like Kobayashi Maki, Itoa Maki, who I just talked about, is an unusual case because we have all these letters where she's basically telling her parents everything she's up to. And it's she who is up to it, it seems like, because her husband's gone most of the time. He is off living elsewhere working, and so all the family matters are left to her. And they're relatively low rank. They never have any money. In fact, that's why they have to take in an adopted son-in-law at a certain point, because he comes with a dowry and they need the money. And this is a concern for a lot of low-ranking families. Even for high-ranking families, they bargain like crazy for adoption dowries and marriage dowries and so forth. So as you say, women are clearly involved in that kind of work. To what degree did women choose their own spouses? That is a story that's very variable by class. I mean, Anne Walthall's work has showed that rural women, in rural communities, marriage was a very informal relationship. Men and women, young men and women in villages were expected to experiment sexually before marriage, and the village facilitated this. And so women had considerable latitude to choose their own spouses, and then presumably some latitude in rejecting them if that didn't work out. So in rural communities with peasant class people, the situation is very different in terms of women having the latitude to choose their own spouses than it is in higher ranking families, especially in samurai families, or wealthy commoner families where women are often married very young, and therefore don't have much say in the process. Some records for women having input into remarriage, their own remarriages, and either objecting or refusing remarriages. Amy Stanley's new book on a daughter of a temple family in Echigo, she escapes to Edo rather than have an unhappy fourth marriage arranged by her family. So 4 marriages, but in the course of the lifetime of this one woman. So it's a mixed, it's a mixed record, and a lot of it we just simply don't know in terms of the degree of agency that women exercised in their own marriage decisions. So.
Thanks. Anybody else of the panelists want to comment on that or on other things they found in other people's papers before we go to the questions?
If I could ask something real quick. So Barbara, I was really struck by your presentation. I really, really enjoyed the sort of strange parallels between our situations. I was kind of thinking, in the situations that I study, there's a constant negotiation over ceremony, how a marriage is ritually brought together. It's interesting how it seems like in Allyson's case, maybe there isn't much ritual around them, but Barbara, I'm wondering in your case, who's controlling the ritual conditions by which a marriage is sort of legitimized? Is it local practices that are being used? Is it a hodgepodge? Is there some sort of distinct ceremony that evolves around this practice?
Again, the sources probably fail us in this. I don't have a precise description of how these marriages were conducted, but I have to, like Allyson, they did also occur at the higher levels. The ruler of Aceh really wanted to marry a princess from England. I mean, he really, really wanted that, and it wouldn't have been a temporary union. So at that level, there would certainly have been some sort of ceremony that died away very, very quickly, when noble families found out that these traders weren't willing to do all the things that sons-in-law were supposed to be doing. But it did persist at lower levels. And there I assume that it was much more informal. There would have been mutual exchange. Gift exchange was critical. So there would have been an exchange of gifts of some kind. It was also common in many areas in traditional terms for a prospective son-in-law to come and live with the family for 3 years before marriage, to kind of give his labor instead of a dowry, as it were, give his labor. And during that time, they would have had sexual relations and so on. Of course, that stopped very quickly when the Catholics got into the Philippines. I mean, they tried to stop it, didn't stop it. So I think that there were various kinds of arrangements, but and there would have been ceremonies of some kind in many cases. But I think in urban settings, these sorts of things start to break down. And as soon as the family isn't there, you know, in a village situation, the family is there, but in urban settlements, you have freed slaves and various people without families. So, so sometimes these freed slaves would buy their own slaves and buy a husband, essentially, create their own families, move out to the environs and so on. So, yeah, so I can't really answer your question.
I just wanted to say that I was really struck, Barbara, by the fact that both of us, in both of our cases, when even these temporary relationships did not work out, women could pursue restitution,
Yes.
you know, and their families could pursue restitution. So I think that's really interesting that that although these are not formalized,
Right.
the expectations are codified, and if you don't fulfill those, people can take, you know, the women can take action against the men or their families can take action against the men.
And I think in societies where written documentation does not enforce trading agreements, where it's oaths or fear of some supernatural punishment or something of that kind, we as modern scholars tend to underrate the power of the spoken word in terms of what is it, codifying. I mean, we don't have a word verbally codifying the arrangement that's going to occur and the symbolism of the gifts that were exchanged. So what that meant, if you had a piece of jewelry or something like that that somebody had given you, it meant something. It was a symbol of a relationship.
That's interesting because, you know, in my world, we privilege dowry contracts and things like that, you know, that are this prelude to formal marriage. But there are all these other ways that people are negotiating the living conditions, the stuff that they're going to get when they move in together. And we never get to see that. But it's clearly happening over and over again, because at least in my case, most of these people are setting up independent households. And so they're getting their furniture and flatware and things from somebody, but it doesn't show up in the traditional legal traditional legal formula.
That's something that's very striking. I mean, I don't know of any cases in which in early modern Japan, women resorted to legal measures to get a settlement from as a result of a failed temporary or informal marriage. They went to court for other reasons, but not that I know of for that. And there very well may have been all sorts of tacit, you know, agreements at the local level that govern behavior, but they're very difficult to chart. They certainly don't show up in the written record very often.
Interesting.
I think sort of picking up a question I'm trying to, that was Amy Freud's question from the Q&A that was asked earlier, I think in response to Barbara's paper, but it strikes me we're kind of on that question now. Sort of, she asked sort of what's the distinction is between cohabitation or concubinage and a temporary marriage, and sort of who determines when a temporary marriage is a temporary marriage or like when it's over. And it sounds like we have a whole range of things, right? Because she said, do both partners have to agree, or, you know?
So I think, well, to use is Allyson some informal marriage. I've used temporary marriage, but I think the key is, even if it's only for 3 weeks, it is one man and one woman. So the woman is the wife and she has charge. So a concubine has no control over whether her partner takes another woman or employs, has slaves for that is also his sexual partner. She doesn't have, unless she has a very dominant personality, but she doesn't have that kind of leverage. But a wife, informal or temporary, whatever we has her kinfolk, her brothers. They'll come and beat up the husband. If, as one of the English said, the Javanese will never allow a Chinese to beat their wives. You know, you've got your family behind you. So in terms of deciding, well, I think we probably all could contribute to when a marriage dissolves. And I think it could be simply not getting along, but I think in the cases that I know best, it's simply abandonment. You know, the husband, usually the husband, is just not around anymore. And then the marriage by itself, without any formal agreement. At the higher levels of society, divorce was more formal, but these are not temporary marriages. So maybe some other people could weigh in there.
Anybody
I
else?
think that's a hard question to answer. Because like I said, I don't think that anybody went into it thinking that they were in my cases, that they were temporary. And so the way that these relationships end are any of a gazillion things that could happen, you know, a fight, deciding to fall in love with, you know, somebody else, running off, migrating, any of those things. And so I think there's no kind of framework for ending them, which is, I think, why, at least in the Spanish case, a lot of people end up in court about them. You know, who's going to pay for the child? You know, who's going to pay for my lost virginity? And so I think because that is what sets up. I mean, the Spaniards are incredibly litigious anyway, but that they, you know, the fact that there's no easy way to end relationships, something with which we are all familiar, you know, they end, it's a problem. And then that problem has to be solved in that moment, either through interpersonal negotiation or legal norms, but it depends who the people are.
And often you mentioned children in your talk, Allyson, and it reminded me that in the port cities, Manila, Ayutthaya, Batavi, you know, these port cities of Southeast Asia, we start seeing street children for the first time. These children whose mothers are low ranking, poor, the entail of the temporary marriage arrangement, whose fathers have gone. And the European authorities in particular are faced with a huge problem, what to do with these children. Sometimes you have fathers who would like to take them away, and then local rulers don't want that to happen. So this problem of children of these unions is often, we need a really good history of children in these kinds of situations in this period of time.
We need a good history of it, but it's so difficult to get. So I have plenty of records, but they're all made by an archival regime that is, anti-source chastening. It seeks to obliterate these sorts of practices from the record. Well, women involved had very little agency except to go to the Chinese authorities, who might tell them that this is an illegal arrangement, it will be dissolved, or they might tell them, I'm sorry, you're permanently man and wife now. No, they can't get out of the arrangement. Now, speaking of these children, you see, this is the inflection point, is when children of mixed heritage, particularly women who aren't taken home by sojourning Chinese or Hindus, start to be buried outside the city walls in a separate cemetery of their own. And then in life are sort of forced into basically only sex work as one of very few options, which in turn gets been censored by the state. And so methodologically, this is just such a headache sometimes, trying to actually find someone's life story when every aspect of it is in some way misrepresented or suppressed.
Yes. Well, you can be asking lots of great questions, but if the sources aren't there, it's difficult. I mean, I think you're doing what we have to do a lot, is use later material judiciously and always carefully, always conscious of change and time discrepancies, but it can often be extremely helpful in clarifying something that's otherwise puzzling or misrepresented in earlier sources.
Yeah,
Actually, go ahead, Marcia, sorry.
sorry. No, I was just going to say that it's striking that, and this was something that I noticed listening to Barbara's paper, that I mean, if we're linking temporary unions to trade, I mean, that can certainly be domestic trade, because in Japan, you know, obviously for the vast majority of the Tokugawa period, international trade was strictly limited. However, you do still have this, I mean, this question of children is interesting, because the one place where you do see the offspring of sojourners, I guess you would call them, and Japanese is in Nagasaki, with offspring of
You're right. Yes.
the Dutch factory. I mean, the Dutch men in Dejima, and also of the Chinese, the Tojineshiki in Nagasaki. And when I've been reading a little bit about Siebold's daughter, Kusumoto Ine, one of the few European Japanese offspring of whom we have any records, because her father was famous, mother was a courtesan. So virtually all of the children born were mothered by courtesans, or women who had relationships with the various foreigners. And you see, apparently, I mean, some historians have pointed out, if you go into the cemeteries in Nagasaki, you can see tons of jizo and monuments to dead children, children who died, who were either aborted or perhaps victims of infanticide, born to courtesans of foreign parents, but very few records of this. And certainly there are instances of foreign men providing for children born to their mistresses, but relatively few of those as well over the course of the entire period.
Thanks. I'm trying to kind of put questions together, and this is a specific one from Veronica Gutierrez, who first of all had a question about children, which we've talked about a little, so it's nice to dovetail in with that. But she also has an instance specific for Allyson, but it may be true in other cases as well, of a Castilian woman being sent from Spain to the New World after having had a child with a married nobleman, kind of informal. It's not really an informal union then, that's sex out of marriage. So she was asking you, Allyson, if you know of other situations where the woman who had had a child out of a non-marital union was sent off to the mother was sent away. Just kind of a different situation than what you're talking about.
It is kind of a different situation. And I actually don't think that that's, even if it does happen, it doesn't happen very often, compared to the large numbers of women who bear illegitimate children, where they're from. Sure, there's going to be women that are going to leave, pregnant women that are going to leave, kind of searching after their men, who have migrated maybe to the Americas. And for all kinds of people, migration to the Americas was an amazing opportunity to start again. You could start fresh. And so I'm intrigued by the idea of sent away, because it could be that she's sent away, or it could be that she was like, I'm out of here. I don't want to see him anymore. I don't want to be shamed by my family or whatever, or I don't want to be forced to marry him. I'm going to Peru. But I've never seen anything at all like that in the archives. So that could just be that I haven't encountered that yet.
Maybe the thing to do, I'll just say, Veronica, is to ask Allyson separately, she's easily findable, because I think it's a really interesting kind of case. And I like to kind of go up. Barbara, you've got something to.
I was just thinking when Eric was talking, and something that we haven't talked about at all here is the Shiite Islamic acceptance of nikah muta, that's temporary marriage. If you look in the Quran, the Surah Nisa, it does say that, and in fact, I just looked it up, lawful to you are people beyond marriage that you seek with gifts from your property, desiring not unlawful sexual intercourse. So for the Shiite Muslims, many Shiite, not all, that is still pertains. So a traveler could engage in these, in Islamic terms, engage in these temporary marriages. Sunni Muslims would say that it's not, it may have been so then, but it's not so now, even though in my case, many Muslims were engaged in this. But it's interesting to contrast the theological or clerical or comments about these kinds of informal or temporary unions and what actually happens on the ground, and whether in fact there's any exchange between those, whether they're just unrelated to each other or whether they actually do have a difference.
So actually, it's interesting you mentioned Southeast Asia. I forgot to mention mut'a as a practice, which is certainly the closest parallel. You know, mut'a in contemporary and modern Iran. It's not called that in this situation, which is strange, and no one apparently knows the term mut'a. Even if you look in the legal records, people in the past have actually asked clerics, so is this mut'a? And they say, what's mut'a? Mut'a is the gift you give someone if you divorce them before consummating the marriage. Right? What do you mean? So it's weird. It seems to have arisen in a separate situation. This isn't known in Western Turkestan. It's known in East Turkestan, Iran, and evidently this justification used in Southeast Asia. Oh, we use Shiite theology in Iran. We're looking at Hanafi law in East Turkestan and other traditions in Southeast Asia. So it seems like it's something which emerges from the economic situation and then finds clerical justification.
Yes, could be, yes.
Pulling things, questions, because Susanna Romney asked a question that kind of takes us in a different situation, which is about slavery. And so she directs it particularly to Barbara, but maybe it's true everywhere, that she, as a woman was enslaved, with a relationship had been considered a marriage, or is something, is slave, what role, I think we can maybe open up the question too, what role does slavery play in these kinds of, you know, in setting the boundaries or not setting the boundaries of these kinds of relationships?
Well, from my experience, a slave is subject to very different situations. She can be beaten. She has no family. That's one of the deciding factors. But also, a slave because most of the slaves in Southeast Asia were not plantation slaves; they were domestic slaves. Every woman of any standing in Batavia, for example, would need at least 10 slaves to go around with her, to hold her beetle box, to own a chair, you know, just to carry umbrella, all kinds of things. So, but maintaining a lot of people in the household was expensive. So these women were also sent out to get some money, sell things, you know, usually sometimes sex, bring their earnings back home. That would not have been expected of a wife. So slaves occupied a different economic situation in the household. They may have been loved, perhaps. They may have gained privileges over time, but it was not a marriage. And particularly of course, in the European settlements, where Dutch men were not allowed to bring their Dutch wives to the Indies. So if they were going to marry, it had to be somebody local, and it had to be a Christian. So inevitably it was a Eurasian, well, most of the time. So a slaves person, but many slaves were given a Christian name and then freed on their master or mistress's deathbed. So then the situation changed a good deal, but let me keep quiet.
So of course, in the Spanish-speaking world, it's really different. And because enslaved people can marry, and free people can marry enslaved people. And so we have this way of thinking about relationships between enslaved people and you know, white slave owners, right? But there's lots of other opportunities. And because in the Spanish-speaking and the Portuguese-speaking world, enslaved people can marry another enslaved, I mean, Catholic marriage, another enslaved person, and or a free person, then it's interesting, you know, so they too have the full array of relationship options available to them. If the person who owns them is amenable to that. And certainly Spanish and Portuguese slave owners are under extensive pressure to allow their slaves to marry. But a couple of places I've gone, I've given talks, and particularly people who study Anglo-North America, they're just shocked to know that there's all these marriages going on. But I think they'd be even more shocked to know that there's this whole array of different relationships. You know, enslaved people in the Spanish-speaking world have a lot of mobility. Most of them, again, in lots of areas are not plantation slaves. They're doing exactly what Barbara just discussed, going out, making money, bringing money home to their owners. And so, you know, they're meeting people along the way. They're falling in love. They're having sex. And they're forming these these informal unions sometimes outside of marriage, and then sometimes they do lead to marriage.
And one thing we do have for Dutch Batavia is these notary tracts where people could buy back into slavery. You know, if they found that they weren't working, things weren't working for them being free, they could recontract with somebody to be their kind of debt slave. You know, if you pay all my debts, I will be your slave is the wrong word, but that's the only one we have. And there would be a notary's agreement to that the Dutch would organize. So, so as you say, there are lots of opportunities and to deal with misadventure, as well as opportunities for advancement.
A question sort of from Dan Siegel that came quite early on was kind of the issue that I think, Barbara, that you brought this up, but it comes in all of the sort of like the definition of a kin group and the whole sort of thing, the point that you were making early on in your talk, Barbara, about you know, that these temporary marriages are part of building up a greater trust network, and in terms of things that operated, you were saying later too, about things that operated with oral agreements rather than all this writing stuff in the Spanish Empire where everything's written down. Is it, you know, what do you sort of see as the boundaries between, is your kin group the people you trust, or the people you trust your kin group? I mean, is this a way to kind of make your kin group, or these temporary marriages a way to make your kin group and therefore the people that you trust bigger? So,
well, I think when we, what Marcia was describing in Japan is foreign to me in the Southeast Asian context, because kinship were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. Land normally passed through the female line. So not everywhere, of course, but it often passed through the female. They couldn't sell it, it belonged to the family, but but a very common feature, I'm sure you find it elsewhere as well, was milk siblings. So if you'd both been fed by the same woman, even if one was a prince and one was a slave, you still had a special relationship, meant that, and all the obligations associated with incest or marriage restrictions applied to milk siblings as well as they did to so slaves, because slaves or women of low birth were often used as, not always, often they were high-born women too, were used as to nurse other children. You had this expanding network of kin that I think, Daniel, to answer your question, I think it's your first thing, you trust your kin, not so much your kin, but kin can become those you trust, because then you will, this very casual thing of, I mean, I am an adopted daughter of a number of families in Indonesia, angkat, you know, because they know me and they like me or whatever it might happen to be. So it's very easy to become part of this ever expanding kinship network, so that you have a multitude of people who are aunts and uncles and cousins and connected in some way, which women remember. They're the ones who really remember the genealogies.
Yeah, I was thinking that kind of relates to the earlier thing about thinking about what women's role is in this. And remember reading somebody or other in Bahia, some Portuguese colony, about how it's the sort of older women who remember, because of rules about consanguinity, who the hell can remember who your seventh cousin is? Well, they could, and they say no, 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 so that they, the pool of marriageable people gets kind of small, which is why you have another reason to have temporary unions, because you don't know anyone that's not your seventh cousin, and so you just stay with something like that.
That's really interesting, and I mean this other line of conversation as well about so when I was talking about consolidation of the family, that's the formal family network, that just the lineage itself is very streamlined, but family kin connections are very important and take you well outside of that family unit. So women, for example, tended to marry out, right, unless you were taking in a husband, but maintained even though they weren't supposed to, in terms of the normative expectations of an out marrying wife, maintained very close relations with their natal families, depended on their natal families for a lot of different things. If they got divorced, they went back to their natal families, were sent back to their natal families. Similarly with adoptees of any sort. A lot of cases where men in particular are adopted, but women as well are adopted out to other families, but essentially are still raised by their natal families. So they're nominally adopted as an heir because somebody needs an heir, but they are raised by their birth mothers. The milk siblings thing, do not see that at all in Japan. I mean, there's a consciousness of it, but there's absolutely no obligation or ties there, and the notion of and there's very few incest taboos. You see plenty of first cousin marriages in families of all at all levels, and that's always been interesting to me. Of course, that goes way back. Yeah.
In Xinjiang, this period, there's a clear class difference. The commercialization of the economy plus forced migration for agriculture, the disruptions of various conflicts and things led to a number of highly atomized families, which sometimes would also form blended families. People would live separately in units of maybe 5 people at most, but they'd often be products of multiple serial marriages. So there were a lot of half brothers and half sisters. And this is one reason why it's difficult to trace sort of consanguinity, inheritance, and things like this. And it looks like, from what I'm seeing, the more elite families either practiced a kind of cousin marriage to keep wealth in the family, or use marriage strategically to forge alliances. And it's largely the lower class families who would use the temporary unions as a way to capture the wealth of sojourners, in goods or in silver. Not necessarily as a way of growing their own network, but of getting something more out of the exchange with merchants who have come to buy up their cotton and take it away.
I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time, so I want to end with a question that comes from James Green about that we've seen, I think, really clearly how what we're talking about here fits into the big story of trade and increasing cultural contact of the early modern period, which is one of the giant stories of the early modern period. But there's some other giant stories of the early modern period that when we teach this, we always talk about, the rise of the nation state, for example, or gunpowder weapons and warfare. Do you see, we've got to do this quickly, but how would you insert this, what we've been talking about here? What other big stories of the period would you sort of insert this into, or do you think that this is reference to? Are there? I mean, I think, trade and intercultural contact is a pretty big story, and we could leave it at that. But do you see it playing out in any other of the things that we usually talk about?
So I think that, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this, I think that this in many ways supersedes a lot of those kind of traditional ways of thinking about the global early modern. This is the world of the global early modern that most people were a part of. I don't think, that the kind of the traditional narrative about guns and conquest and stuff, that's a part of it. But this is what more people experienced. These were the issues that most people were dealing with. And so I think that if we're gonna rank the stories, then this is part of the really big story about relationships and about the way that relationships get transformed by cultural contact of a variety of sorts. I think that's why we do this.
And I think for much of the world, the transference of ideas of the nation state, which is really coming from Europe, just doesn't work. Particularly if you look at Southeast Asia. Now there are 11 countries in Southeast Asia, but in the period that I'm talking about, there was no Indonesia, the Philippines was just kind of there being claimed, but Siam, Burma, I mean, there were just no nation states in that kind of the way that people might think about them in Europe. So to me, yes, I agree with Alice. I mean, I don't think we only see ideas about clashes between nation states and the racial implications that goes with that, really in starting up in the 19th century. You know, it's a much later development. And I think it's not really terribly helpful in talking about in the kinds of things we were talking about in this panel.
Yeah, similarly, this is, oh, I'm sorry, Marcia.
No, go ahead.
This is a story about how economic changes and changes in how an empire is run lead to changes in the family, which in turn lead to tensions around who belongs to what group, whether it's linguistic or it's religious. And the nation isn't there yet, but you can see the tensions emerging. So I would simply say that I agree. I think we're seeing all these things play out at the most intimate level, which is where we should have been looking all along.
Yeah, so much of early modern state building is family building, right? Both internationally and domestically. So I think this is where we look. Yeah.
I mean, I think that we as sort of modern people we sort of forget that states are about heterosexual relationships that produce children. That's the state in my feeling about it, or the empire in this period. And if you didn't have children, this is a real problem. You know, and Habsburgs knew it, we just forgot it. Or, you know, and I don't know who the equivalent, you know, the Qin, I mean, we just watch this, why is there this dynastic thing? Because they didn't have the right number of boys, or, you know, I mean, so it just, it may be a kind of, when we start to look at the very top levels, people certainly understood it then, and we just sort of, those 19th century guys made us all forget it. Said, well, the state is about men. No, it's not. It's about heterosexual relationships that produce children, or not. So thank you all. Debbie, do you take this over again? Is this what?
Yes, I'll just wrap us up by offering a second thanks to our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. This was a fascinating session, a fascinating conversation. And finally, just a special thanks to our presenters today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank
you guys so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.